If someone had told me 10 years ago that I'd be spending a weekend sharing a cabin with Julian Vance, I would have assumed it was the prelude to a very specific, very humiliating anxiety dream. The kind where you show up to school without your pants. Only in my version, the source of all terror and fascination is standing there, watching you. Julian Vance. Even his name felt solid, like something carved from oak. In high school, he was the center of gravity, a planet, and the rest of us were just dust and debris caught in his orbit. He moved with an easy, athletic confidence that I could only ever observe from the safety of the library stacks, my own world built of paper and silence. I was a footnote in the margins of his epic poem. My life now was quiet, deliberately so. I was a research archivist for the city's historical society, a custodian of forgotten stories. My days were measured in the rustle of brittle paper and the scent of aging leather. I lived alone, in a small apartment that overlooked a perpetually damp alleyway. It was a life of carefully curated solitude, a fortress built to keep the unpredictable world at bay. I like my routines. Coffee at 6:30, the same route to work, lunch at my desk. It was a predictable, manageable existence, a life designed to prevent surprises. Julian, as I understood it from the curated glimpses social media offered, was all surprise. He ran his own successful construction company. Photos showed him on mountaintops, on boats, surrounded by laughing friends. He was still building things, still a center of gravity, while I was carefully preserving things that were falling apart. The distance between us wasn't just 10 years. It was a different universe. He was loud, I was quiet. He was motion, I was stillness. He was the sun, and I was the creature who thrived in the cool, comfortable shadows, which is why the invitation felt like a summons from another world. Northwood High, class of 10 years ago. A reunion. Not just a single, awkward evening in a rented-out bar, but a full weekend retreat at Black Creek Lodge. 3 days of forced nostalgia. My first instinct was to burn the invitation. My second was to shred it. My third, and most sensible, was to file it under absolutely not. I hadn't kept in touch with anyone, save for Clara. Clara, who had been my only real friend, a buffer between me and the overwhelming social machinery of high school. And it was Clara who called me 3 days after the invitation arrived. "You're going," she had said, not a question. "I'm cataloging a collection of pre-war city planning documents that weekend. It's fascinating stuff, Leo. You can't use dusty maps as an excuse for the rest of your life." She was right, of course. That was the most infuriating thing about Clara. She was always right. So I agreed, reluctantly. A weekend of polite smiles and strained conversations about mortgages and children, two subjects on which I was deafeningly silent. It would be a special kind of hell. I packed a bag filled with books, my armor against unwanted social interaction. I drove the 2 hours north, the city shrinking in my rearview mirror, replaced by dense walls of pine trees. The air grew colder, cleaner. My stomach, however, with a knot of hot, anxious bees. Black Creek Lodge was beautiful, I had to admit. A sprawling log-and-stone building overlooking a lake that was the color of steel under the overcast sky. It was aggressively rustic, designed to make people like me feel even more out of place. I checked in, got my name tag, Leo Sterling, a name that felt like it belonged to someone else, and the key to my cabin. Cabin 4. I was supposed to be sharing with Clara, a small mercy, but Clara wasn't there when I pushed open the heavy wooden door. Someone else was. He was standing with his back to me, looking out the large picture window at the lake. He was broad-shouldered, filling the space in a way I never could, dressed in a simple gray Henley that strained across his back. I knew that silhouette. I had spent 4 years cataloging it from a distance. He turned, and the air left my lungs in a silent rush. Julian Vance. His hair was shorter than I remembered, and there were fine lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 10 years ago. But it was him, the same strong jaw, the same mouth that always seemed to be on the verge of a smirk. He looked solid, real, infuriatingly handsome. He frowned, a slight furrow in his brow. "Sterling, what are you doing here?" His voice was deeper than I remembered. It vibrated in the small room. "This is Cabin 4. I managed, my voice a dry whisper. I held up my key as if it were evidence. Yeah, in my cabin, a cold dread, familiar and sickening, washed over me. This was a mistake. A horrible, cosmic joke. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Clara. OMG, so sorry. Last-minute switch. Had to share with Amy after her roommate bailed. They put you in with Julian. Isn't that hilarious? Catch up later. Hugs and kisses hilarious. My heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. I felt the sudden, overwhelming urge to turn around, get in my car, and drive until I ran out of gas. Julian was still looking at me, his expression unreadable. Not hostile, but not welcoming either. Just assessing. I felt like a specimen under a microscope. There must be a mistake at the front desk, I said, my words tripping over each other. I'll go sort it out. Doubt they have any other spots, he said, gesturing vaguely towards the window. Place is packed. Looks like we're stuck. He didn't seem happy about it, but he stated it like a fact. Like a problem with a foundation or a load-bearing wall. An issue to be managed, not agonized over. I stood frozen in the doorway, my bag digging into my shoulder. The cabin was small. One room, really. A fireplace, a small kitchenette, and 2 beds. 2 single beds, pushed against opposite walls. The distance between them felt both immense and terrifyingly small. This was my life now. For the next 48 hours, I was trapped in a small wooden box with a living, breathing embodiment of my entire adolescent insecurity. The weekend was a blur of forced pleasantries. I tried to make myself as small as possible, a ghost haunting the edges of conversations. I saw people I hadn't thought about in a decade, their faces softened by time, their ambitions either realized or abandoned. Julian was predictably in his element. He moved through the crowds with the same effortless grace he'd had in the high school hallways. People clapped him on the back, laughed at his jokes. He was still the sun. I avoided him. It was a surprisingly easy thing to do. He was always surrounded, and I was always looking for an exit. We only returned to the cabin late at night, to sleep, the space between us filled with a thick, unspoken silence. I would lie in my bed, rigid, listening to the sound of his breathing in the darkness. It was a slow, steady rhythm that was both maddening and strangely comforting. I watched him when he thought I wasn't looking. It was a habit I'd never quite broken. On the second morning, I woke up early, before the sun had fully risen. The cabin was cold. I saw him standing by the window again, just a silhouette against the gray morning light. He was holding a mug of coffee, and for a long moment, he didn't move. He wasn't the confident king of the reunion then. He just looked tired. There was a weariness in the line of his shoulders that I'd never seen before. A crack in the marble facade. I saw him rub the back of his neck, a gesture of deep fatigue. Later that day, there was a mandatory group activity. A hike. My personal version of hell. But not going would draw more attention than going, so I went. I lagged at the back of the group, content to watch the heels of the person in front of me and focus on not tripping over a root. Julian was up at the front, of course, setting a brisk pace. During a break, I saw him sitting on a fallen log, away from the main group. He was staring at his phone, his brow furrowed in frustration. He swiped at the screen, then muttered a curse under his breath. It was a moment of unguarded irritation. Human. He looked up, and our eyes met. I looked away instantly, my face flushing hot. A jolt, sharp and unwelcome. But the image was seared into my brain. I'd noticed something I hadn't seen before. A thin, white scar that cut through his left eyebrow. It was almost invisible unless you were looking for it. A tiny imperfection. A story I didn't know. I also noticed his hands. They weren't the smooth, unblemished hands of a high school athlete anymore. They were a man's hands, calloused and scarred, with dirt permanently etched into the lines of his knuckles. The hands of someone who built things, who worked. That evening, there was a bonfire by the lake. The air was cold and smelled of pine smoke and damp earth. I found a spot on a bench at the edge of the light, nursing a beer I had no intention of finishing. It was my prop, my shield. Julian was in the center of it all, telling some story that had a circle of people laughing. I watched the firelight dance across his face, casting shifting shadows that made him look older, more serious. Then, the unexpected happened. He broke away from the group and walked towards me. My heart hammered against my ribs. A flight or fight response honed by years of adolescent avoidance. There was nowhere to run. He stopped in front of my bench. Mind if I sit? I just shook my head, unable to form words. He sat, leaving a respectable distance between us, but the heat from his body seemed to radiate across the gap. We sat in silence for a long moment, watching the flames. The crackle of the fire was the only sound. "You're quiet," he said finally. "I'm an archivist," I replied, as if that explained everything. Maybe it did. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Right." Another silence stretched. This one felt different, heavier. "I need to ask you a favor," he said, not looking at me. He was staring into the fire. I was so surprised, I almost dropped my beer. "A favor?" "From me?" "Okay," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "They want me to give a little speech tomorrow. At the closing brunch. Some bull about, I don't know, success, the future. And I'm terrible at this stuff." He finally turned to look at me, and in the flickering light, I saw it again. Not arrogance. Not confidence. Something else. Vulnerability. "I heard you right. For the Historical Society Journal, right?" Clara mentioned it. He looked deeply uncomfortable, like a man admitting a profound weakness. I can't get the words right. They sound stupid when I write them down, and just like that, the world tilted on its axis. Julian Vance, the boy who could do anything, who excelled at everything that mattered in that small high school world, was asking me for help. With words. My only territory. My only strength. I can look at it," I said. A wave of relief washed over his face. It was so visible, so profound, it stole my breath. "Really? That would be a huge help." He reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, holding it out to me. Our fingers brushed as I took it. It was nothing, a fleeting, accidental contact, but it felt like a brand. A sudden, searing heat shot up my arm, straight to my chest, where my heart stuttered and seized. It was electric, overwhelming. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. My entire body was humming with the phantom sensation of that touch. I think I stopped breathing. He didn't seem to notice. Or if he did, he didn't show it. He just nodded, a quick, grateful gesture. "Thanks, Sterling," he stood up. I'll see you back at the cabin." And then he was gone, melting back into the crowd around the fire, leaving me alone on the bench, my hand tingling, my mind reeling. The crumpled paper in my hand felt impossibly heavy. The dynamic had shifted. I wasn't just the quiet observer anymore. He had asked me for help. He had let me see a crack in his armor. And he had touched me. Later that night, the sky opened up. Rain hammered against the roof of the cabin, a relentless, deafening rhythm. The wind howled through the pines, and the whole world outside our small wooden box seemed to be dissolving into chaos. Then, with a flicker and a hum, the lights went out. We were plunged into absolute darkness. "Great!" Julian's voice came from across the room. A dark shape in the dark. My heart was pounding, a frantic drum against the backdrop of the storm. The darkness felt intimate. All the visual cues that kept us in our separate orbits were gone. We were just two voices, two sets of breathing in the black. "There should be candles," I said, my voice sounding thin. "In the kitchen drawer?" I heard him rustle around, the sound of a drawer sliding open, the clink of glass. A moment later, a match scraped, and a small, flickering flame bloomed in the center of the room. He lit a few thick pillar candles and placed them on the small table between our beds. The light was soft, golden, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. It made the small cabin feel even smaller, like a sanctuary against the raging storm. He had the speech I'd rewritten in his hand. I had taken his clumsy, earnest points and woven them into something coherent. Something that sounded like him, but better. He sat on the edge of his bed, and I sat on mine. The space between us was charged. "This is really good," he said, looking at the paper and then at me. "It sounds like me, but smarter. You had all the right ideas," I said, my gaze fixed on the flickering candle flame. "They just needed to be organized." He was quiet for a moment. The rain beat a steady rhythm on the roof. "You were always good with words," he said softly. I remember your essays in Mr. Henderson's English class. He used to read them out loud. I froze. He remembered that? He remembered anything about me at all? I hated that. I confessed. Having everyone look at me. Yeah, but the word were good, he insisted. He looked at me, his eyes dark and serious in the candlelight. I was always jealous of that. Things were easy for me. Sports, math. It all just clicked. But words, they never felt right in my head. Or on paper, it was the most astonishing thing I'd ever heard. Julian Vance, jealous of me, of anything about me. The concept was so foreign, my mind struggled to process it. Your life seemed perfect. I admitted, the confession slipping out before I could stop it. He let out a short, harsh laugh. It wasn't a happy sound. Perfect? Man, you have no idea. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, the candlelight carving deep shadows into his face. My old man, he had my whole life mapped out. College football scholarship, business degree, take over his firm. Every move I made, he was watching. Every grade, every game. It was a lot of pressure. I felt like I was suffocating. He shook his head, staring at the floor. Started my own company, working with my hands. That was the first thing I ever did just for me. He hated it. Still does. Thinks I'm wasting my potential being a glorified carpenter. The confident, golden boy from high school dissolved before my eyes. In his place was a man who seemed lost, burdened by expectations I couldn't even imagine. A man who was, in his own way, just as trapped as I had been. I never knew, I whispered. No one did, he said. That was the point. Always had to be the guy who had it all together. He looked up at me, and his gaze was so direct, so vulnerable, it felt like a physical touch. You always seemed like you had it together. You were quiet. You were smart. You didn't seem to care what anyone thought. I cared, I said, the words aching in my throat. I just learned how to be invisible. It's easier than trying to be something you're not. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty. It was filled with everything we hadn't said for 10 years. The storm raged outside, but inside our small, candlelit world, everything was still. He stood up and walked the few steps to the window, looking out into the black, rain-streaked glass. I noticed you, he said, his back to me. His voice was low, almost lost in the sound of the rain. In the library, in the halls. I didn't know how to talk to you. You were in your own world. I didn't know how to get in, my breath caught in my throat. This is a dream. I am dreaming. Any moment now, I'll wake up in my cold, empty apartment. He turned around slowly. The space between us was only a few feet, but it felt like a canyon. This weekend, he said, taking a step closer, sharing this cabin. I thought it was going to be awkward as hell. It has been, I said, a faint, shaky smile touching my lips. He smiled back, a real smile this time. It transformed his face. Yeah, it has been. He took another step. He was so close now, I could feel the warmth of his body. I could smell the faint scent of soap and rain and something that was just him. But it's also been, he trailed off, searching for the word. He didn't need to find it. I knew. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before it gently cupped my jaw. His thumb brushed against my skin, and my whole world narrowed to that single point of contact. His hand was rough, calloused, but his touch was impossibly gentle. My eyes fluttered shut. My heart was a slow, heavy drumbeat. Leo, he whispered. He'd never said my first name before. It sounded like a prayer on his lips. He leaned in, and I met him halfway. The kiss was nothing like I had ever imagined. It wasn't a firework. It was a slow thaw. It was hesitant, questioning a discovery. His lips were soft, warm, and they moved against mine with a searching tenderness that undid me completely. It was a kiss that spoke of years of unspoken things, of distances crossed, of a connection I never thought possible. It was a confession, and I confessed back, my hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the solid, steady beat of his heart beneath my palms. It was the most honest conversation I'd ever had. I woke to the pale, gray light of morning filtering through the window, and I was alone. The bed beside me was empty, the sheets and blanket neatly pulled up. For a wild, hopeful second, I thought he was in the bathroom or making coffee. But the cabin was silent. Too silent. A cold, Sharp dread pierced through the warm haze of my memory. I sat up. His bag was gone. His jacket was gone from the hook by the door. On the table, where the candles had burned down to pools of wax, was his room key. He was gone. No note, no text, no explanation, just an absence, a void where he had been. The silence in the room was a physical weight pressing down on me, crushing the air from my lungs. The memory of the night before, of the kiss, of his confession, soured in my mind. It twisted, curdled into something ugly. It was a mistake. That's all it was. A moment of weakness brought on by the storm, the darkness, the alcohol. A drunken, stupid mistake. Or worse, pity. He felt sorry for the quiet, lonely archivist. And in a moment of misplaced kindness, he had, what? Throw me a bone? My stomach churned. Humiliation, hot and acidic, rose in my throat. I was an idiot. A naive, foolish idiot. To think that Julian Vance, the son, could ever be interested in someone like me. I had let myself believe, for a few stolen hours, that the universe could bend in such a way. That our two orbits could actually intersect. I had been wrong. The brunch was a nightmare. I moved through it in a daze, the cheerful chatter of my former classmates a meaningless roar in my ears. I kept scanning the room, a desperate, foolish part of me hoping to see him, hoping for an explanation. But he wasn't there. Someone mentioned he'd checked out at dawn, had to get back to the city for an emergency work thing. It was a plausible, sensible lie, but I knew the truth. The emergency was me. I drove home under a sky the color of a bruise. The beautiful pine trees that had seemed so majestic on the way up now felt like the bars of a cage, closing in on me. I didn't listen to music. I just listened to the sound of the tires on the wet pavement and the relentless, looping monologue in my own head. Stupid, stupid, stupid. The following week was the longest of my life. I went back to my routine, to my fortress of solitude. But it was different now. The silence in my apartment wasn't peaceful anymore. It was mocking. It was filled with the ghost of his voice, the memory of his touch. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would leap into my throat with a sickening lurch of hope, only to crash back down when I saw it was just a news alert or a message from my mother. The absence of a message from him was, in itself, a message. The loudest one of all. It said, "Forget it happened." It meant nothing. We are nothing. I try to bury myself in my work. I focused on the delicate script of a 100-year-old letter, on the precise details of a forgotten map. But his face was superimposed over everything. The scar on his eyebrow, the tiredness in his eyes, the way he looked at me in the candlelight. My carefully constructed world had been breached. He had gotten inside, and now that he was gone, he had left a gaping hole. My solitude, once a comfort, was now just loneliness. A sharp, aching loneliness that I hadn't felt so keenly in years. He had shown me what connection could feel like, only to snatch it away. It was crueler than never having it at all. By Friday, a full 6 days after I'd last seen him, I had almost managed to convince myself it was for the best. I had rebuilt my walls brick by painful brick. I would forget him. I would go back to being the quiet archivist. It was safer this way. No risk, no pain. I was working late, trying to finish cataloging a new acquisition. The archives were silent. The only sound the quiet hum of the climate control system. I was safe here. Nothing could touch me. And then I heard footsteps. Heavy, solid footsteps echoing in the marble hallway outside my office. My head snapped up. No one else was supposed to be in the building. The footsteps stopped outside my door. A knock. Soft, hesitant. My heart stopped. It couldn't be. I stood up on shaky legs, my hands clammy. I walked to the door and pulled it open. It was him, Julian. He looked terrible, worse than he had at the lodge. He was pale, his eyes were bloodshot, and he had a dark stubble on his jaw. He was wearing a dusty work jacket and jeans, and he looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He just stood there, looking at me, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and raw, desperate apology. "Hi," he said, his voice rough. I couldn't speak. I just stared, my mind a blank wall of shock. Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped back, holding the door open. He walked into my small, cluttered office, looking out of place among the stacks of books and archival boxes. He seemed too big for the room, too real. He turned to face me, wringing his hands together. The confident, easygoing man was gone. This was someone I didn't know, someone vulnerable and afraid. "I'm so sorry, Leo," he said, the words rushing out. "I'm so sorry. What I did, leaving like that, it was cowardly. It was a stupid, panicked, asshole move, and I'm sorry. I found my voice, but it was brittle. You had a work emergency." He shook his head, his eyes pleading with me. "No, there was no emergency. The emergency was in my head." He took a deep breath. "I woke up that morning, and you were there, sleeping, and I freaked out, you freaked out." I repeated, the words flat and lifeless. "Yes, because I have never felt what I felt that night. Not ever. It was huge. It was terrifying." He ran a hand through his hair, his movements agitated. "My whole life, I've been playing a part. The guy who has it all figured out. And with you, I didn't have to. For the first time, I felt like someone actually saw me. The real, screwed up me. And it scared the hell out of me." He took a step closer. "I ran. Not from you. I ran from how much I wanted to stay. How much I wanted to wake you up. How much I wanted more." He looked down at his scarred, calloused hands. "This whole week has been hell. I haven't been able to think about anything else. I've tried to work, tried to pretend it didn't happen. But it's no good. The silence, your silence, it's been killing me." My carefully rebuilt walls crumbled into dust. All the anger, all the humiliation, it just evaporated, replaced by a fragile, tentative hope. "Why are you here, Julian?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He looked up, and his eyes were shining with an emotion so raw, so open, it made my chest ache. "Because being scared is better than this," he said. "This emptiness. Because that one night in that cabin felt more real than my entire life up to that point. And because I think I'm falling for you, Leo. And it's the scariest and best thing that's ever happened to me." Tears pricked at my eyes. I had spent so long believing I was invisible. And here was the one person I always wanted to see me, saying he saw me all along. "I thought it was a mistake," I confessed, my voice thick. "I thought you regretted it. The only thing I regret is leaving," he said, closing the remaining distance between us. He gently took my hand, his rough fingers lacing through mine. The same jolt of electricity, but this time it wasn't a shock. It was a connection, a current. This is new territory for me. For both of us, I guess. It's okay to be scared, but I don't want to be scared alone anymore. He lifted my hand and pressed a soft kiss to my knuckles. "I want to be scared with you." He pulled a single, worn brass key from his pocket and pressed it into my palm. It was warm from his hand. This is for my house," he said, his voice unsteady. "It's not much yet. I'm still renovating it. But I want you to have it. I want you to be able to come over whenever you want. I want you there." It wasn't just a key. It was a promise, an invitation, an admission that he was building a life and wanted me to be a part of it. A tangible, solid piece of his future, right there in my hand. And in that moment, I knew I had a choice. I could retreat back to the safety of my fortress, or I could step out into the terrifying, unpredictable world with him. It wasn't really a choice at all. The next morning, I woke up not to a cold, empty cabin, but to the smell of coffee and the sound of quiet movement in a kitchen that wasn't mine. I was in Julian's bed, in his house. Sunlight streamed through a large, uncurtained window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The room was sparse, a work in progress. Unfinished drywall, tools in a corner. But it felt more like a home than my perfectly curated apartment ever had. I hadn't woken up alone. He was here. I found him in the kitchen, pouring coffee into two mismatched mugs. He was wearing a paint-splattered t-shirt and a pair of worn gray sweatpants. He looked tired, but the deep weariness in his eyes was gone. He looked peaceful. He saw me, and a slow, warm smile spread across his face. "Morning, morning," I said, my voice still thick with sleep. He handed me a mug. Our fingers brushed, and this time there was no panic. Just a familiar, comforting warmth. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping our coffee, the morning sun warming our faces. This was the new normal. Domestic. Simple. and utterly terrifying in how wonderful it felt. There was no anxiety, no fear of him disappearing, just a quiet certainty, a sense of rightness. Later, we sat on the floor of what would one day be a living room, surrounded by blueprints and sketches. He talked about his plans for the house, his voice filled with a passion I'd never heard before. He wasn't talking about load-bearing walls and support beams. He was talking about creating a space to live in, a place of light and warmth. He kept looking at me, asking for my opinion. Where should the bookshelves go? Would this be a good corner for a reading chair? He wasn't just showing me his house. He was inviting me into his blueprint. I spent the weekend there. We talked for hours, filling in the 10-year gap with stories and confessions. We ate takeout on the floor and fell asleep on his couch watching an old movie. It was all so simple, so mundane, and it was the most extraordinary weekend of my life. Lying in his bed that night, with his arm draped over me and his steady breathing a comforting presence in the dark, I thought about the man I was just a week ago. The man who lived his life in the margins, who built walls to keep the world out. I had dreaded that reunion. I had seen it as a threat, a disruption to my carefully ordered existence. And it had disrupted everything. Julian Vance had walked into my quiet, monochrome life and filled it with color and sound and feeling. He wasn't a plot twist I never saw coming. He was an entirely new book, a story I never thought I would be brave enough to write, let alone live. The fear was still there, a faint hum beneath the surface. It was the fear of the unknown, the fear of having something so precious you couldn't bear the thought of losing it. But for the first time, the hope was stronger than the fear. I had spent a decade observing him from a distance, a silent archivist of a life I could never be a part of. But I was wrong. The distance was never as great as I had imagined. And the person I was so afraid of turned out to be the one who was waiting to tear down my walls and build a home with me instead. My old life was safe, predictable, and lonely. This new life was terrifying, uncertain, and filled with a light so bright I knew I could never go back to the shadows again.